Hey dear restless mind, tonight we slip into a world where the cold bites first, long before any Viking sword does. You stand on the wind-ripped shoreline of Kaupang, Norway, the year carved sharply into the sagas as 823 CE, when winter has arrived too early and too violently. Snow churns sideways across the fjord, stinging your eyes, while 30 longship crewmen brace themselves against a gale that shrieks like something ancient and hungry. The salt spray freezes the moment it touches anything, your cloak, your eyelashes, even the ropes coiled at your feet. You smell the tang of cold iron, wet wool, and pitch-soaked timbers. You taste brine every time the wind changes direction. A shipmaster shouts an order, but the storm folds his voice into its own roar, swallowing it whole. This is the moment before the launch, before the longship pushes into a black heaving sea that doesn't want company. And as you stand there trying to decide if frostbite will claim your fingers or your soul first, you realise a tiny, horrifying truth. Out on that open water with those men, in that wooden dragon-proud beast, you probably won't survive this. But that's exactly why we're going. Because tonight's journey answers a question that sounds impossible. How did Vikings heat their ships on icy seas without fire? Spoiler, they didn't. At least not the way you think. And the real methods are far stranger, colder, and more ingenious than any Hollywood longship could show you. Before we step aboard, go ahead and tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if your room is warm right now, savour that luxury a little extra. Now take a deep breath, tuck your hands into your sleeves, and brace yourself, because the cold, the creaking timbers, and the long night ahead are waiting for you. Drift with me across this frozen sea. The ship slides from the shoreline with a heavy groan, its dragon-shaped prow rising and falling like the breath of some sleeping monster. You steady your footing on the deck, already feeling the boards quiver beneath your boots. Viking longships aren't cosy floating houses. They're long, shallow, cleverly narrow vessels designed for speed, flexibility, and landing on hostile shores, not for warmth or comfort. Every plank is smeared with tar to keep water out, but that tar also happens to be deliciously flammable. Which is why the entire idea of having a big cosy fire on board is exactly the kind of thing that would get you laughed out of a Viking living room, right before someone gently suggests you test the structural integrity of the ocean from beneath it. The cold is different out here. On land, winter is annoying. On a Viking ship, winter becomes your entire personality. The open deck stretches endlessly. No cabin walls, no roof, no shelter except the thick wool of your own clothes and the person bracing shoulder to shoulder beside you. You feel the wind slice across your face as the ship cuts forward, and each time a wave slaps the hull, a burst of freezing spray leaps up to greet you directly in the eyes like a rude sea-dwelling cat. The first joke whistles out from a bearded crew member near you. Cold enough to freeze a troll's toes off. No one laughs. Not because it's a bad joke, though, yes, but because everyone is too busy concentrating on staying alive. Your fingers try to curl themselves into tiny mutinous walnuts inside your gloves. Every breath forms its own ghost in front of you. And despite the 30-plus bodies aboard, the longship feels unbearably open, like a wooden ribcage drifting through the void. Heat has nowhere to collect. Warmth evaporates instantly, shredded by wind and spray. This is the heart of the problem. Viking ships were masterpieces of craftsmanship, but a terrible place for fire. The deck is wooden, the planks are wooden, the mast, sails, oars, wood, wool, pitch. Everything around you politely requests that you do not ignite it. Yet here come the waves, colder than a tax collector's handshake. The ship is essentially an enormous, sleek bathtub that refuses to acknowledge the existence of privacy or insulation. And the Vikings somehow survive this. You lean on a bench beside a rower, whose beard has enough ice crusted into it to qualify as a separate ecosystem. He explains through chattering teeth that the cold is so intense during winter voyages that even the ink in carved runes can crack, and the animals aboard, goats, chickens, sometimes even pigs brought for food, huddle together like fuzzy heat-producing batteries. The man also casually mentions that during certain voyages, Warriors lost toes or fingers to frostbite without even noticing until landfall. He says this with the same tone modern people use to talk about losing a phone charger. Another blast of wind rips across the deck. You swear your bones try to migrate deeper inside your body, and still no fire, not even a tiny candle. Open flame on a Viking ship is dangerous enough during summer. During winter storms, it's a certified the gods are laughing at you moment. You edge closer to the mast, trying to hide behind something that definitely does not block wind. The world becomes a symphony of shivering planks, snapping ropes, and the low groan of the ship arguing with the sea. One sailor cups his hands around his mouth, blowing warm air into them in desperate little puffs, like trying to heat Greenland with a birthday candle. There's warmth here, though, just not the kind you expected. It's in the muscles of the crew, pulling the oars in steady rhythm. It's in the thick, oil-treated wool they wear, and it's in the belief that cold is just another enemy, and enemies can be endured. Another warrior leans toward you with a grin. If you think this is cold, he says, you should try standing guard on the cliffs above Trondheim in midwinter. You laugh. Is either that or cry frozen tears. The ship lurches over a wave. You grip a sideboard to avoid becoming a human ice sculpture thrown overboard. There's no shelter, no below deck, no cosy private quarters. Under the benches you find personal chests, weapons and spare ropes. Absolutely nothing resembling a heater. A sudden gust sends snowflakes swirling across the deck, dancing like tiny white sparks. They settle on every surface and refuse to melt. You realise, with a tiny shiver of awe, that the Vikings designed their ships intentionally open so water could drain and the crew could manoeuvre. Warmth was sacrificed for survival. Everything, everywhere, is cold. The benches, the ropes, the sails stiffening with frost. Even your thoughts feel like they're forming slower, crunchier, more reluctantly. The ocean around you is black and enormous, with only the pale glow of a moon smothered by clouds. Somewhere a man mutters a prayer to Njord, god of the sea, not for warmth, but simply for safe passage. Warmth is a luxury. Surviving is the goal. Your boots slip slightly on the frost-glazed planks. The Viking next to you steadies your arm, and in that moment you understand the real heat on this ship. Shared endurance. Every step, every breath, every miserable shiver is communal. You're part of the crew now, for better or frostbitten worse. Deep in your chest a simple realization blooms. If you ever complain about a slightly chilly office, you will think back to this moment and formally apologize to your thermostat. The ship sails on, cutting through the winter darkness, and as the wind claws its way through your clothing once more, you wonder how these people, who conquered seas, raided kingdoms and carved their stories in runestones, kept themselves warm enough to stay alive. That answer comes next. You shift your weight on the frozen deck, trying not to look like the least competent person aboard, which you absolutely are. But in fairness, you're also the only one whose clothing wasn't designed for this level of existential cold. The Viking beside you watches with a mixture of amusement and pity, then thumps your shoulder in a friendly way that nearly knocks you overboard. His cloak billows in the wind, and you finally notice just how many layers he's actually wearing. It looks deceptively simple, just wool, fur and leather. But there's a method to this madness, and it begins with the one thing Vikings trusted more than strength or steel. Wool. Not cute sweater from your grandma wool. This is the kind of wool that feels like it could bench press a boulder. You run your glove along his sleeve and feel the weight of it, dense and oily. Viking wool wasn't fluffy or soft. It was woven from sheep that grew thick lanolin-rich coats. Lanolin, the natural oil still clinging to the fibres, makes the garment repel water like a rude teenager ignoring chores. Snowflakes that land on it simply sit there confused, refusing to melt. That means the cold can't sink in, the wet can't creep through, and your body heat, precious and finite, stays trapped against your skin like a guarded secret. Under that coat he's got another layer, tighter woven wool, softer but still thick enough to double as light armour. Beneath that are tunics, maybe two, each one catching and holding warmth. You'd think this many layers would make rowing impossible, but Vikings had a habit of building clothing that moved when they moved, stretched when they stretched, and didn't bind at the seams. You watch as the crew adjust their cloaks, pulling the edges in tight to seal off the wind. They move with annoying competence, while you, meanwhile, feel like a wet piece of laundry pinned to the railing. If you peek beneath their cloaks, you'll find something else. Shirts made of linen or wool worn directly against the skin, insulating the chest and absorbing sweat so it doesn't cool the body when the wind shifts. Sweat management mattered more than people realise. If you get wet out here, you don't just feel cold. You become a historical footnote titled "Person Who Should Have Stayed on Land." One elder warrior lifts the bottom of his cloak to show you another trick. A belt cinched tightly around his waist. Not for style, not for holding weapons, but to trap rising body heat beneath the layers and keep warm air from escaping upward. Heat is currency on a Viking ship, and the crew treats it like treasure. He demonstrates by tugging the cloak down over the belt again, sealing it like the world's grumpiest burrito. You mimic the motion with your own cloak, which mostly results in you punching yourself in the ribs. But hey, it's the thought that counts. Then there are the furs, not giant movie-style capes made from 12 bears and a dramatic backstory. No, Vikings used fur strategically. Small pieces line the inside of boots, gloves and collars. A strip of fox or marten fur around the neck traps the heat rising from your chest, warming the blood that flows through your major arteries. That alone can keep your whole body from dropping into dangerous temperatures. The collars are adjustable too. When the wind picks up, the Vikings pull them higher, letting the fur cradle their faces and protect their noses from freezing. A few men even have beaver fur hats, practical, ugly and ridiculously warm. You consider stealing one, but then remember theft from Vikings is usually followed by new and exciting forms of sadness. Their boots, you notice, are miracle objects in themselves. Boots made of reindeer hide with fur on the inside, woolen socks beneath them, and sometimes even wrapped footcloths for extra insulation. You wiggle your toes inside your relatively pathetic shoes. Yep, you can no longer feel them. Great. Another day of adventuring, another limb reconsidering its relationship with your body. Young oarsman tugs your sleeve and shows you something else. Strips of cloth wrapped around his wrists and ankles. Heat leaks from the ends, he explains, tapping the fabric. By binding wrists and ankles, the Vikings trap warmth in the core of the body, reducing heat loss by a surprising amount. The cloth strips may look unassuming, but they're basically medieval thermal technology. If a modern outdoor store sold these, they'd slap a logo on it and charge you half a paycheck. And then you notice something strange. Some of the crew rub oil on their garments. They dip fingers into small leather pouches, smear the oil along the outer layers of wool, then push the fabric between their palms. The result is a breathable, water-resistant barrier that keeps snow and sea spray from soaking into the cloth. Oil-treating fabric isn't about fashion, it's about not becoming a Viking popsicle. One man even oils his beard, which seems unnecessary until you learn it prevents ice from forming too heavily in the hair. You make a mental note to tell your friends that Vikings invented beard oil centuries before it became trendy and overpriced. The layering itself is an art form. You watch the crew move, bend, lift oars, lash rigging and stretch ropes, and the clothing shifts with them. Vikings layered not for aesthetics but for survival, choosing garments that could slide against each other, trap heat, release sweat, and stay flexible. They were basically wearing a scientifically engineered insulation system that just happened to be made from sheep, cows, and the occasional fox. You look down at your own outfit. It resembles something the wind would politely reject. The Viking nearest you gives you a once-over that communicates without words. You poor, poor creature. Then he hands you a spare wool tunic, which weighs roughly as much as a medium-sized child. You pull it on, feeling instantly warmer, like being hugged by a slightly damp cloud, but still far from comfortable. The crew continues adjusting their layers with a muscle memory so ingrained it looks like ritual. One man tucks his gloves beneath his sleeves to seal off drafts. Another folds the bottom edge of his cloak under his thighs when he sits, creating a warm pocket of air. A woman, yes, sometimes women sailed too, shows you how she wraps her scarf around her head, pulling it over her ears and jaw to keep frost from forming along the edge of her skin. She does this in 3 swift movements that make her look like she's preparing for battle with the weather itself. Then comes the body heat trick you absolutely weren't expecting. When the cold becomes truly unbearable, Vikings press their hands under their armpits or between their thighs. Not graceful, not glamorous, but wildly effective. Your armpits are basically the VIP club of your body's heat production. If warmth is the enemy of death, your armpits are the bouncers. The Vikings know this and embrace it without shame. At one point, 2 oarsmen even lean back to back to share warmth through their cloaks. It looks awkward but intensely practical. You file that under things I will never do unless a Viking orders me to. You notice something else. Vikings move constantly. They shift, stretch, row, adjust ropes, stomp their feet, rub their hands. Motion is heat, and heat is survival. A Viking who sits still for too long becomes a Viking who freezes. So they keep their muscles engaged, turning their own bodies into slow-burning furnaces. You join in, marching in place, rubbing your hands, lifting your shoulders, doing whatever it takes to convince your blood to keep flowing. The sailors teach you one final trick: breathing through your nose, not your mouth, and pulling your scarf or glove over your face to warm the air before you inhale it. Cold air can sap your body heat from the inside. Vikings warm their breath the way you warm soup, slowly and deliberately. As the longship pushes deeper into the icy sea, you begin to understand that these tricks, these layers, these movements, are the reason Viking voyages weren't mass funerals. They couldn't rely on fire, so they turned their own bodies into their heating system. Each layer is a barrier. Each motion is an ember. Each breath is a small personal hearth keeping you alive. And as snow continues drifting across the deck, you begin to feel, just barely, the whisper of warmth beneath all the wool. You might still lose a toe. Honestly, you probably will. But at least now you have a fighting chance. The cold settles deeper into your bones as the longship heaves through the grey water, and you start to realise something slightly terrifying. The Vikings didn't rely on fire to warm themselves, but that doesn't mean fire never came aboard. It just meant that when it did, it arrived like a dangerous guest, invited only when absolutely necessary, supervised closely, and always kept at a distance from anything that could turn your ship into a floating bonfire. The Vikings understood heat the way modern people understand electricity. Incredibly useful, but capable of making your life much shorter if mishandled. And since the whole vessel is coated in pitch, dry wood, wool and rope, all of which respond to fire with enthusiastic self-destruction, their methods required creativity, caution, and a healthy respect for the fact that drowning was only slightly less unpleasant than burning to death. Your first glimpse of the fire situation happens near midship, where a burly sailor crouches over a squat iron object you hadn't noticed before. It looks like a shallow bowl with 3 stubby legs and a handle, almost like a miniature cauldron missing its lid. The man lifts it slightly, and you hear the faint rattle of something inside. He gestures for you to come closer, but warns you not to touch it yet. The wind snaps across your face as you kneel beside him, and he carefully tilts the bowl so you can see the contents. Nestled within the iron pan are small, smouldering pieces of charcoal. No flames, just a lazy red glow pulsing softly like the heartbeat of some tiny creature. The warmth drifting upward is faint, barely enough to warm your fingertips, but on a Viking ship in winter, even a whisper of heat is a treasure. These iron fire pans, sometimes called braziers by modern historians, weren't used for lighting bonfires or creating roaring flames. They served a more humble but essential purpose: preserving embers. Embers, unlike open fire, don't dance mischievously toward nearby rope or sailcloth. They don't spit sparks across the deck. They simply smoulder, protected in a container that keeps them alive through storms, wind, and sleet. The Vikings treated embers like seeds. You don't plant them on the ship. You carry them until you reach a place where fire is safe. Those glowing coals might later become a cooking flame on land, or a full fire pit once the ship beaches on a distant shore. But here, in the icy middle of nowhere, their job is simply to stay alive. The sailor explains this with a grin, tapping the side of the iron pan. The clang is sharp and clean, and somehow even that metal sound feels cold. Iron conducts heat well, which is both a blessing and a curse. It keeps the embers warm, but also threatens to radiate that warmth downward into the wooden deck. To prevent this, the Vikings set the pan on a thick layer of damp sand, or sometimes on slabs of green wet wood that wouldn't ignite easily. They build this little platform like a safety cradle, making sure the heat stays isolated. The sand absorbs excess warmth, and the air around the pan disperses any rising heat before it becomes a danger. You watch as the sailor sprinkles a handful of sand beneath one of the legs, adjusting the pan's position carefully, as if he's balancing a sleeping infant. Another crew member brings over a lidded clay container, simple, dull brown, and surprisingly heavy. He crouches beside the iron pan and gently spoons a glowing ember from the brazier into the container using a pair of iron tongs. You see a small bed of ash inside, insulating the coals so they won't jostle too violently or break apart. Then he closes the lid and clamps it shut with a leather strap. That airtight container will hold the ember for hours, maybe longer, keeping it alive even through storms that would drown an open flame instantly. Vikings carried embers this way whenever they needed to start fires on land quickly, an invaluable skill when your survival depends on making heat before the cold makes decisions for you. You imagine arriving on a frozen shore after a long voyage, knowing you have only minutes before the cold steals sensation from your hands. Bringing ready-made embers means skipping the miserable, tedious process of spark making, shaving kindling, and nursing tiny flames to life. With a clay ember box, you simply deposit a glowing coal into dry tinder and blow. Fire blooms like a promise. But you also learn that embers served another purpose on ships. Occasionally, the crew used them to heat small metal tools, the tip of a knife, a hook, a nail, softening the metal just enough to reshape something or repair a minor problem. This was delicate work. Done with precision, and always with someone standing nearby holding a bucket of seawater just in case. Even a small accident could make the difference between surviving a voyage or feeding fish. The Vikings weren't reckless. They were careful in the way only people who face danger daily can be. Every ember was both ally and threat, and the crew refused to let that duality escape their attention. Still, the brazier isn't the only warming tool aboard. Near the stern you find another sailor cradling what looks like a lumpy leather pouch. He opens it and reveals a small clay object inside, an oval stone-like piece that radiates faint heat. Stones heated on shore before departure could remain warm for hours when wrapped properly. While this isn't fire, it's a form of heat storage, the kind that warms hands or protects food from freezing solid. The clay is wrapped in layers of wool and fur, making it feel almost alive against your cold palms when he lets you hold it. It's not enough to heat the ship, but it's enough to unfreeze your spirit for a few minutes before the wind inevitably steals the warmth back. A warrior with frost in his beard tells you that during calmer weather, embers could also be used in portable cooking setups, never for full meals, but sometimes to warm broth or melt snow for drinking. On more protected ships with partial coverings, such as Nars used for trade, the crew occasionally set up a tiny, sheltered brazier to boil water or heat food. But longships, especially warships, were far too exposed. You look around now, the deck is a wide-open landscape with no walls, no roof, no place to hide even a small cooking flame. The idea of lighting anything more than a handful of embers here feels reckless. The crew knows it. You know it. And even the embers seem to know it, glowing quietly inside their iron prison like subdued warriors waiting for permission to fight. The most surprising part comes when one sailor explains the trick of cupping heat. When embers were stored inside an iron pan or clay box, the Vikings sometimes placed the container near their feet, never directly on the deck, always on insulating sand, to warm their legs while rowing. But this wasn't comfort, it was medical strategy. Frozen limbs stop working. Rowers with numb legs can't row. Hands that stiffen can't pull ropes or hold weapons. A single ember box moved methodically among the crew could prevent catastrophic loss of mobility. It was like sharing one tiny heater among dozens of people, each taking a turn, each receiving enough warmth to keep blood flowing and muscles responsive. You watch as the clay ember box gets passed from one person to the next, each holding it in their gloved hands with a reverence. It's barely warm, more suggestion than sensation, but on a ship where every breath crystallizes, even a suggestion of warmth feels like a blessing. You ask one sailor how they prevent sparks, and he laughs. "We don't make sparks," he says plainly. "Not here." The Vikings understood that striking iron against iron could create tiny glowing fragments that might drift into rope or wool. So all ember handling tools were made with careful design, smooth edges, curved shapes, minimal risk. Even the tongs have rounded ends, meant to grip coals without grinding. The crew moves around embers with a choreography born from centuries of practice. No one rushes, no one fumbles, and no one acts like fire is a toy. You spend several minutes watching their ritual. The brazier is adjusted, sand is levelled, the ember box is checked, the wind is studied. The sailors exchange glances like silent language. Then they secure everything again, tying down the iron pan so it doesn't slide across the deck when the ship tilts. The ropes they use are dampened slightly to resist ignition. They secure the clay container in a padded nook beneath a bench, cushioned by wool scraps. It's the safest place available, and even then someone checks it every few minutes. The shipmaster walks by, eyeing the brazier with the same expression someone might give a misbehaving toddler. His approval matters. If he thought the situation dangerous, the embers would go overboard instantly, sacrificed without hesitation. Heat is important, yes, but not as important as the ship. A burned ship is a coffin. A cold ship is a challenge. Vikings chose the challenge. As the wind shifts and the cold intensifies, you find yourself huddling a little closer to the faint warmth drifting from the iron pan. You're careful not to let your cloak touch it or block the air around it. The sailor beside you tilts the pan to show you how the embers brighten when exposed to a soft breath of wind. He shields them with his body, preventing the gusts from whipping across too quickly. Everything is controlled, moderated, deliberate. You start to notice how the crew positions themselves around the brazier, not clustering too close, not leaving it unattended, moving just enough to absorb the warmth without risking their clothing. It's like a dance, slow and thoughtful, each movement dictated by centuries of knowledge. The Vikings knew that fire, even in ember form, demanded respect. The ship sails on and the brazier continues its quiet work. The clay ember box waits patiently beneath the bench. The heated stones wrapped in wool pulse gently with fading warmth. These are not luxuries, these are tools of survival, as essential as the oars or the sails. Fire on a Viking ship is not a roaring hearth but a subdued hum, a heartbeat carried from shore to shore, sheltered, protected, and never trusted completely. You realise that warmth aboard a Viking ship is not something you create. It is something you manage, preserve, and ration carefully, like a story passed through generations. The embers glow softly, stubbornly, as if reminding everyone aboard that even in the bleakest cold a spark can endure, if it is tended with vigilance. And as you sit there, feeling the faint heat drift against your frozen fingers, you understand why these people survived voyages that would have ended most others. They didn't rely on luck, they didn't rely on comfort, they relied on skill, patience, cunning, and a relationship with fire that bordered on sacred. The longship cuts forward, the cold deepens, and the embers burn quietly on. The voyage drags deeper into the cold, and your stomach reminds you with a low, miserable growl that warmth isn't just something your hands and feet crave. Your insides are staging a rebellion too. You imagine for a moment what a steaming bowl of soup or a hot drink would feel like right now. But the wind laughs at your fantasy and slaps your face with more freezing spray. Still, the Vikings had their ways, and it turns out that one of the greatest sources of heat on a winter voyage was not fire at all, but food. A subtle, slow warmth radiating from the centre of your body outward, keeping you alive in conditions that should have sent you to an early saga ending. These people didn't heat their ships, but they heated themselves from within, and as you watch them work, eat and prepare their supplies, you begin to understand the strange brilliance of their methods. A few of the crew rummage beneath the benches, pulling out tightly bound bundles wrapped in waxed cloth and sealed with pitch. These are food stores, prepared days or even weeks before the voyage. The cloth is stiff with cold, frost clinging to the edges like a thin crust of glass. One of the men unwraps a bundle, revealing thick slabs of dried fish, dense with protein and salt, the kind of food that survives storms, winter, time, and probably the apocalypse. It's not warm and it's certainly not glamorous, but it's fuel. And fuel in a place where your body shakes itself like a coal stove fighting extinction is the first line of defense against freezing. As you chew a piece of it, the salty taste overwhelms your tongue, and you wonder if you've made a terrible life decision. But after a few bites, you feel a faint glow of energy. Like your stomach has remembered how to function. That's the point. Viking food is survival disguised as chewable misery, but not everything is cold or dried. Before setting sail, the Vikings heated stones, smooth, rounded, river-worn stones the size of your fist, placing them near the hearth on land until they absorbed the fire's heat. Wrapped in wool and stored in sealed wooden boxes, these stones retained warmth for hours, sometimes an entire day, and that lingering heat could be used for more than warming hands. One warrior pulls out such a box, unwrapping the layers of insulation with care. The stone inside is no longer hot, but still pleasantly warm, radiating a gentle heat that fogs the air slightly when he lifts it into the winter wind. He places it into a leather cup-shaped holder and sets a small skin flask atop it. The contents inside slosh softly. Thin broth, made earlier that morning and packed in a skin container. Using only the leftover warmth of the stone, the broth slowly melts from its half-frozen state and becomes drinkable again. You kneel beside him, mesmerised. It's not hot, not the way a hearth-warmed stew would be, but the liquid is no longer icy. The steam is faint but real, drifting upward in tiny white ribbons. When he hands you the flask, the warmth spreads down your throat and into your chest, and the sensation almost knocks you backward with relief. The Vikings knew that heat travels inward from the stomach more effectively than from any external source, and so they prioritised foods that produced internal warmth. Fatty meats, dried fish, preserved butter, and even lumps of tallow provided slow-burning fuel that kept the body generating heat long after the meal ended. One man pulls out something that looks vaguely like wax. It is indeed hard animal fat, shaped into rough, pale blocks. He carves a small piece off with his knife and pops it into his mouth with no hesitation at all. You stare in horror until he explains that fat is the secret to not dying. Your body burns it slowly and steadily, creating warmth that lasts even during long rowing shifts. You break off a piece, hesitantly, and it melts on your tongue like unseasoned misery, but the effect is almost immediate. Your body stops feeling like a chilled corpse at a surprise audition, and instead feels grounded, functional. It's still cold, but now it's survivable. Water, of course, is another problem. The sea all around is undrinkable, and any water carried in skins quickly freezes in the winter wind. The Vikings solved this with a combination of insulation and clever use of body heat. Some water skins are wrapped in layers of wool, tucked close to the torso beneath cloaks, using body warmth to keep them liquid. Others are buried deep under the benches among blankets, furs and spare clothing. When snow falls onto the deck, some sailors collect it in leather bowls and tuck the bowls beneath their cloaks. The snow melts slowly, kept just warm enough by their bodies to become drinkable. You watch one man shake his head vigorously while holding a bowl to his chest, muttering, "Better lukewarm than dead." Another sailor suggests you try the same. You do, and the cold bowl presses against your ribs, but within minutes you feel the snow softening, turning slushy, then liquid. There are also heated stones used to warm food inside small clay pots, just as one crewman did with a broth flask. Others take warm stones from their wool-wrapped boxes and place them beneath cooking pots, small containers tightly sealed and packed with porridge, barley mash, or stews prepared on land. Even a warm stone with no flame beneath it can help soften the contents, reduce freezing, and make the food edible without risking fire. A woman on board unwraps one such pot. Inside is a barley porridge, dense and slightly warm, flavoured with dried berries and a hint of honey. You take a spoonful and nearly weep, not because it tastes good, though it does, but because it feels like a small sun settling into your belly. Another method becomes clear when a sailor pulls out a clay jug wrapped tightly in wool and leather. Inside is mead, thick, sweet, and carrying the residual warmth from when it was poured earlier in the day. Alcohol doesn't freeze as easily, and mead in particular remains drinkable even in brutal cold. It warms your throat, your chest, and your courage all at once. The sailor offers you a sip, warning you that too much will make you feel hot while you actually continue freezing. The joke is on you, because one sip feels like you could hug an iceberg and win the argument. But you hand it back religiously. Vikings didn't drink to stay warm. They drank to stay sane, and you're still new here. Better to stay sober enough to not fall overboard. Then there's the thermal magic of containers themselves. Vikings used wooden bowls, horn cups, leather pouches, and clay vessels in ways that seem almost modern. A thick wooden bowl insulates surprisingly well, especially when wrapped in fabric. A horn cup warmed by a person's hand keeps liquid from freezing longer than a metal one ever could. Clay pots retain heat like memory. These simple materials did the job of thermoses centuries before thermoses existed, and many meals aboard ships were preserved by nothing more than clever design and layered wrapping. Food consumption aboard the ship follows a rhythm. Small bites throughout the day, never large meals at once, because digesting constantly generates heat. Vikings knew intuitively that eating frequently meant staying warm. At one point, the shipmaster himself hands out small chunks of dried cheese and dried meat, making sure everyone eats something before the next rowing shift. Digestion is fuel. Fuel is warmth. Warmth is life. It becomes a cycle of feeding the fire within, since the ship cannot host a fire without. During a brief calm in the weather, two sailors pull out a compact travelling pot, a small metal bowl with a lid, and place a warmed stone beneath it. Inside are vegetables softened earlier in the voyage, mixed with broth so thick it's halfway to a solid. As the heat from the stone radiates upward, the mixture loosens. One man stirs it lazily, and soon enough the pot emits a faint scent of onion and turnip, a smell so comforting you feel tears prick the corners of your cold-crusted eyes. The crew passes the pot around, each person taking a small spoonful. When your turn comes, the food is only warm, not hot, but the effect is overwhelming. You feel yourself thaw just a little, enough to straighten your spine and unclench your jaw. You hadn't realised how tightly you'd been bracing yourself against the cold until the warmth began uncoiling your muscles from the inside out. Heat, you realise, doesn't have to be intense to be transformative. Even mild warmth, especially in the middle of relentless ice and wind, can send shivers of life into every frozen nerve. The Vikings relied on this truth. They didn't chase roaring heat aboard the ship. They embraced small, steady, controlled warmth delivered through clever preservation, thoughtful preparation, and an unbending commitment to staying alive. You notice that whenever food or drink containing warmth becomes available, the crew quiets. Conversations soften, movements slow. It feels like an unspoken ritual, the acknowledgement of warmth as sacred, fleeting, precious. They consume it with gratitude and discipline, knowing the next chance might be hours away or longer. And as you sit among them, letting broth linger in your mouth, letting the feeling settle deep into your chest, you feel strangely at peace for the first time since boarding this wooden soul-testing machine. The longship shudders as a new wave hits. The crew braces. The containers are rewrapped, secured, hidden once more in insulated storage. The stones are packed away, slowly cooling but still useful. The sails snap above you, and the cold rushes back in, fierce and immediate. But now you're ready for it. Your stomach glows faintly with warmth, and your limbs respond when your brain sends orders. You feel alive in a way you didn't before. You look at the Vikings around you, faces hard, eyes alert, layers wrapped tight, bodies fueled from within, and it hits you. Their survival wasn't luck or brute force. It was strategy, ingenuity, preparation. They turned food into heat, containers into insulators, stones into portable warmth, snow into water, and tiny sips of mead into courage. They didn't heat the ship. They heated themselves, over and over, in ways so clever and efficient that even the cold sea couldn't argue with them. And now, warmed from within, you prepare for whatever the icy ocean throws next. Warmth lingers faintly inside you after the broth and the stones, but the ocean wastes no time stealing it back. The wind rises again, claws sharp, and sleet begins to fall in sideways streaks that sting your cheeks. The longship groans under the weight of the weather, its frame flexing the way a living creature tenses its ribs. You instinctively huddle deeper into your cloak, but the Vikings around you don't retreat with fear. They move with purpose. This is when communal warmth becomes more than comfort. This is when it becomes survival. A few of the crew gather toward the centre of the ship, not crowding but forming a subtle cluster, shifting closer the way migrating birds press wing to wing. It looks casual, but it's intentional, honed through a lifetime at sea. Their bodies become a shared furnace, radiating small pockets of heat trapped beneath wool, fur and leather. You drift toward them without thinking, drawn like a moth to a flame that isn't fire but human presence. One of the older sailors, whose beard is now stiff with icy beads, pats the bench beside him. When you sit, he pulls the edge of his cloak around you, creating a cocoon of fabric so unexpectedly warm you gasp. He chuckles softly and explains in a low voice that huddling wasn't a sign of weakness among Vikings, it was a respected tactic. Warriors sat hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder, trading warmth efficiently, letting each person's body shield the next. The crew understands heat flow the way others understand social cues. They sense when someone drifts too far into the cold and instinctively adjust, closing ranks like wolves in a storm. You feel the warmth spreading along your side, subtle but steady, sinking through your layers until it touches the parts of you the wind had begun to numb. It feels embarrassingly intimate at first, but everyone aboard behaves as though this closeness is as normal as breathing. The shipmaster steps among the crew, checking faces for signs of cold exhaustion. Pale lips, glassy eyes, the kind of bone-deep stillness that hints at hypothermia. When he finds a younger rower who has clearly drifted toward dangerous chill, he lifts the man's arm and pulls him firmly into the circle of bodies. There is no judgment, only the unspoken, urgent rule. No one freezes if the group can prevent it. The rower shivers violently at first, teeth rattling like clattering stones, but the warmth of the group slowly melts the frost from his expression. You watch as the life trickles back into him, colour returning like ink blooming across a page. Communal heat isn't a metaphor here, it's medicine. Another crew member shows you how to sit to maximise warmth. Knees pulled up, cloak draped over them, hands tucked inside sleeves. Head lowered slightly so your breath warms your chest instead of floating uselessly away. He demonstrates without fanfare, adjusting your position the way a parent might reposition a child. You mimic him, and the effect is immediate. The warmth you produce stays with you instead of flying into the wind like wasted energy. The Vikings call this keeping the fire inside. You can almost feel it flickering, fragile but real. When the wind sharpens again, several crewmen drag long, heavy woolen tarps out from beneath the benches. At first they look like ordinary cloth, but when unfolded they reveal themselves as thick, tightly woven ship cloths, massive coverings treated with oil or beeswax to repel water. In calmer seas, these tarps protect cargo. In brutal winter storms, they transform into makeshift shelters. The crew threads the tarps along the gunwales, then pull them up and over the central section of the ship, fastening them with practiced knots. The tarp sags with the shape of the wind, forming a low, tented canopy across part of the deck. Underneath it, the air becomes noticeably warmer within minutes. Not warm by any civilized standard, but warm enough that your breath no longer freezes on your eyelashes. You duck beneath the canopy, and the difference is striking. The sleet still hammers above, but the interior feels sheltered, hushed, almost womb-like. The bodies around you radiate heat that collects in this enclosed space, held close by the tarp. It's not airtight. Nothing aboard a Viking ship is, but it blocks the worst of the wind, creating an environment where your own heat can finally defend itself. The floor beneath you is layered with rough woolen mats, scratchy but effective at preventing the cold from seeping up through the planks. The crew spreads themselves across these mats, everyone sitting close enough to share warmth, but still able to reach tools, ropes or weapons if needed. A Viking ship never truly rests. Someone pushes a fur-lined skin toward you and motions for you to lean back against it. The interior is stuffed with feathers and wool, forming a crude but effective cushion that insulates your spine from the cold boards. You sink into it gratefully as the shelter continues to rise around the group. Another tarp is draped over part of the bow, and one more is tied at the stern. The ship is never fully enclosed. You'd suffocate or get trapped if it capsized, but the overlapping layers create pockets of refuge. These pockets trap shared heat the way cupped hands hold a flame. One of the women aboard, a trader heading to a distant settlement, shows you how she and her family travelled on ships, sleeping in nested configurations, parents curled around children, older siblings tucked between adults. No gaps, no spaces, just a tight press of bodies arranged for maximum warmth and minimum exposure. She describes journeys where snow covered the deck so thoroughly that only their shared heat kept them alive until landfall. Her voice carries no fear, only memory and matter-of-fact resilience. You see it in her posture, upright, steady, rooted, like one of the ship's own ribs. She has known storms that would turn your spine into decorative pasta. The wind howls particularly violently, and the ship leans. A few men brace themselves automatically, hands pressing against the tarp-covered frame to steady it. You brace too, though much less gracefully, earning a sympathetic snort from someone nearby. The sleet thickens, rattling against the canopy like handfuls of thrown grain, but beneath it, a strange calm settles. The communal shelter holds. Everyone stays together. Every shared movement feels choreographed by centuries of seafaring necessity. A warrior sitting beside you flips his cloak open to reveal a thick layer of fur lining. He spreads half of it over your legs without saying a word. Vikings didn't waste warmth. They redistributed it instinctively. When one person had excess and another lacked, the solution was obvious: share it. The man shrugs when he sees your gratitude, as if to say that this is as ordinary as handing someone a cup of water. You realise with a small jolt that if you froze out here, he would feel responsible, not personally, but collectively as part of the crew. If the group fails one member, the sea claims that failure. Survival is a shared duty, and no one escapes that obligation. The storm continues to rage, and the communal heat becomes the ship's core. You begin to notice a rhythm to it, the subtle shifts of bodies leaning together, the slow exhale of breath warming the cramped space, the constant adjustment of cloaks and hoods to seal in whatever warmth hasn't already escaped. Someone tucks a wool blanket around your shoulders. Someone else presses a warm stone, faintly heated earlier, into your hands. The woman with the trading goods rests her arm lightly against yours, sharing warmth through the contact. The young rower who earlier nearly succumbed to the cold now sits between two burly men, sandwiched safely, his body shivering less with each passing minute. The Vikings also construct windbreaks even without the tarps. When the weather becomes less violent but still cruel, they angle shields along the ship's sides. The shields overlap like scales, creating a barrier against the wind. You watch as the crew sets them up with fluid coordination, building a kind of wooden ribcage that protects the inner rows from the icy blasts. Between the shields and the bodies pressed close, the ship becomes a shifting patchwork of micro-shelters, each a pocket of survival. The shields, normally instruments of war, now serve as guardians against the wind. You run your hand along one and feel the carved patterns, the grooves worn by years of battle. Now those same grooves channel warmth downward, catching stray drafts and redirecting them away from the group. As the ship continues forward, you start to understand the Viking approach to warmth as a philosophy rather than a single method. They don't create heat, they defend it, they protect it, they preserve it in every possible form, within their clothes, their food, their embers, their stones, and most of all, their community. A lone Viking on a winter sea is a tragedy waiting to be sung about. A Viking among crew is a force that even the cold cannot easily dismantle. Eventually the wind shifts, and the snow eases into a gentle drift. The tarps are loosened but not removed, allowing fresh air to circulate. The crew stretches, shaking numbness from their limbs, but they don't scatter far. Even in calmer weather, warmth remains a communal effort. You catch sight of two men sitting back to back, sharing the heat from their cores. Another man lies on his side using a friend's legs as a pillow, while yet another pulls a child-sized bundle of furs into his lap, a package that, to your shock, contains a very small dog. The dog yawns, blinks sleepily, and goes right back to snuggling. Even animals are part of the warmth economy aboard this ship. Small dogs and cats sometimes sailed not just as companions or pest control, but as living heat sources. You scratch the dog behind the ears, and it presses closer, radiating innocent warmth like a tiny smug heating unit. The storm finally dwindles to a frosty whisper, and the crew begins to restore the ship to its open configuration. The tarps are folded tightly and secured. The shields are returned to their racks. The communal huddle slowly dissolves, but not entirely. You still remain closer to the group than before, drawn into their unspoken circle of shared survival. The warmth lingers not just in your body, but in your understanding. You've witnessed how Vikings endured the cold, not as individuals, but as a single organism made up of many bodies, many breaths, many lives intertwined by necessity. When you step back into the open air of the deck, the cold greets you again. But now it feels different. Less like a predator and more like a familiar rival whose tactics you've begun to understand. The sea stretches out in every direction, bleak and beautiful, the horizon a pale smudge between ice-grey sky and darker waves. The crew resumes their work, adjusting ropes and oars, voices steady and calm. You stand among them now, wrapped in layers, warmed by food, fortified by shared heat, and sheltered by the temporary tents that transformed the longship into a floating den of survival. You came aboard wanting to know how Vikings heated their ships on icy seas without fire. Now you know the truth. They didn't heat their ships. They heated each other. They heated themselves. They turned their vessels into moving communities where warmth was a collective resource, guarded, shared, preserved. Fire wasn't their salvation. Human connection was. And as the ship glides forward, carving its quiet path through the winter sea, you realise that the greatest warmth in this brutal, freezing world comes not from flames, but from people. The storm fades behind you, leaving the sea in a hush that feels almost tender after the chaos. The longship rocks gently, the timbers creaking with a soft, familiar rhythm, as if the vessel itself is yawning after a long, exhausting battle with the cold. The wind becomes a low murmur along the sail, brushing against your cheek not with claws now, but with cool, calming fingers. You let your eyes drift half closed as the distant horizon softens into a ribbon of muted silver, blurring with the sky until there is no clear line between ocean and air. The crew moves more slowly now, their steps quieter, voices lower, wrapped in the natural stillness that settles after hardship. You feel the last of the shared warmth lingering in your cloak, in your sleeves, in the memory of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder under the sheltering tarps. That warmth settles deeper, past your skin, past your bones, into a place that feels steady and safe. Your breath falls into the ship's rhythm, the slow inhale as the hull rises, the gentle exhale as it settles again. Even the cold seems to loosen its grip, losing the sharpness it held earlier, and smoothing into a chill that nudges you toward rest rather than resistance. In the dim quiet, every creak becomes a lullaby, every sigh of the sea a soft whisper pulling you further toward stillness. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your thoughts grow slower. Let the last traces of tension melt into the wooden bench beneath you. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. And even the vast winter sea, so fierce only hours ago, now rocks you with the same patient care it offers its bravest travellers. Breathe deeply. Let the journey dim into a dream. Let the cold slip away like a fading story. Sweet dreams.